So, hello, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jessica Litt. I am the Director of Business Affairs for the Dramatists Guild of America. If you're not familiar, the Dramatists Guild is the national trade association for playwrights, composers, lyricists, and librettists. Today, I am joined by Deborah Murad Esquire, the founder of Empower Art Legal and Consulting Solutions. Previously, she served as the executive director of the Dramatists Guild Copyright Management and as the Guild's director of business affairs many moons ago. Heather Holinsky is a Philadelphia-based dramaturg and literary manager. She also serves as the VP of membership for LMDA. And Erisa Ann Riley, playwright, screenwriter, performer, and educator. So today we will be discussing how to develop contests and festivals for writing in educational settings. So when students enter the industry after they graduate, and often before, I know Heather knows this from our time at KCACTF, contests and festivals are some of the first opportunities they have to showcase their work. So not all contests and festivals are created equal, and often writers will jump at any opportunity that comes their way. So what if they've already experienced what it's like to be a part of a great contest or festival while they're still in school? That gives them tools to go out into the world to know what to look for. So let's get started. I'm going to start off with some kind of like setting the tone questions for each of our panelists, and then we'll kind of get more into the nitty gritty. So I'm going to start with you, Erisa. As a playwright, what are you looking for when you're applying for a contest or festival? Do you have any particular memorable experiences working on one that you want to share as well?
Oh, yeah, for asking me here. I think kind of what you were mentioning right now in the beginning, when I first started applying to contests and festivals, it was kind of like, let me throw pennies into the wishing well and see what lands and just kind of apply for anything and everything. That's not to say I don't still do that to a certain extent, but after a while and after some experience, you start to realize if they're saying they need a play with less than 5 characters, don't send them a play with 7.
Right.
And things like that. And after certain experiences, you start to realize, where your work fits. I think something now that I always look for is, is my play speaking to the themes, and or is my work speaking to the themes and I guess the aesthetic of the festival. Is what I write in line with the festival, or is my not just aesthetic, but my mission as a playwright, does it align with the mission of the festival or the organization that I'm applying for? Because I am Latina and I write bilingual plays, I'm always applying to specifically Latinx festivals. Anything that speaks to my identity, I will apply to. And I think for me, a really memorable experience working with a festival was one of my first festivals that I worked on, which was Bay Area Playwrights Festival, of kind of realizing within that experience of the reality of like how much time you have and like what you can work on. And I think what I really learned through that experience was applying to things with a play that, like, what you want to work on in that time and space can be supported by that time and space. And it taught me a lot about like if it's a 15-hour workshop, applying with a play that needs a 15-hour workshop, not a play that needs a 5-hour workshop or a 25-hour workshop. And to me, all of those things came with like more time and experience and more realizing how long it actually takes me to develop something, and how certain festivals can support that, and how some, you take what they are offering you to work on specific things. That's kind of been my experience working with festivals. And when I was in grad school, I think I looked for anything that supported students, anything that was specific to graduate students, anything that was like, this has a ticking time clock for me because I'm in school for 2 years and I can apply to this thing so many years. Kennedy Center I applied for while I was in grad school, or whenever that time lapse is. And just really taking advantage of the time that I was spending in school and still had that like status as a student.
Yeah. I think what you just said about understanding what the festival can provide your particular play is also something really good for educators to think about, like what do your students need, and that's the kind of festival that you kind of want to develop for them.
Yeah.
Because if you're just developing a random festival and all of the playwrights are like, well, I actually have a bunch of 10-minute plays that I need to develop, I don't have a one act play to develop, then what's the point of developing the festivals? I think that's a really good point. So thank you so much for
Right.
that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Heather, in your former role as the literary manager for Playwrights Foundation, you recently engaged a group of playwrights, and I know Erisa was also a part of this, in a survey asking them about the best and worst parts of applying for contests and festivals. And I'd love for you to just share some of the highlights, maybe some of the not so good parts of that study that you found.
Yes, so happy to be here and so happy to share some fresh numbers. Before I do, I just like to backstep and just say, a thesis of mine as a literary manager, can all be like encapsulated in empathetic and compassionate, diverse readership, open to non-traditional work. How do you practically make that happen? And since we sort of like have know each other through Kennedy Center, I'm also somebody like in my purview, I've seen many education programs. How do you even train students to read and evaluate new work? So it's very exciting the more new works festivals that can be brought to a college campus, because how do you train students to not just say dramaturgy is I'm a production dramaturg on Hairspray, but also dramaturgy is this massive task that the profession is dealing with because of the scarcity of opportunities for professional playwrights, that they have to go through these very narrow channels. And it just feels like this crazy labyrinth maze of a game. And so I'm really grateful for this document that Dramatists Guild has. It really is a document that as a practitioner, I use as my major source text. It's sort of a religious document for me in some ways. It's the Dramatists Guild's guide is something that I absolutely use and refer to all the time in meetings. Say, are we in alignment with these practices? Because in some ways, the document to me represents playwright consent. Like, here's what the professional group of playwrights have created in forms of consent. And so this is how we should then operate and be very intentional and thoughtful about what we do. So now I'm going to quickly share some fresh numbers. In this study was, and I can get through this in 3 minutes. I promise I'll like just drop the data and we can unpack it later. Is that there were 500 playwrights, and they were all playwrights that actually had achieved some semi-finalist or finalist level with us. So they're playwrights that were like happy with the work that Playwrights Foundation were doing. 71% of writers desired either no application fee or an organization that offered sliding scale. They had multiple options to pick from. 47.5% wanted just clear explanations on the website. And also accessible, simple applications. When asked, like, what are some major points of concern, like 1 to 3 major points of concern, they were application fees, number 1, 2, clarity on how plays are being evaluated, and number 3, unclear communication and lack of transparency on the organization's part. And then another subpoint of that is only wanted the play read, not extra artistic statements. And then when asked what would be helpful in creating more transparency, playwrights wanted clarity about what is a good fit for the organization, more interactions with staff, and and this is dicey, there's like, I can we get into this later, put a pin in this one.
Yeah.
Some desired feedback about a process, but how that feedback is delivered is a major crazy sticky point. So I don't want to say also give feedback, because there's consent issues in that. But to double back to number 2, which is more interactions with staff, as educators, you need to be prepared for the type of work it's going to take to interact with a large group of playwrights who want to know what's going on. So if we can even kind of like settle on some of that data, I have more that I can interlace into this conversation, but
Yeah.
I'd like to kind of offer that up to the room.
I mean, that's really good to know because we're going to be talking about all of those things. I mean, the fact that you brought up application fees as like the number one, when I hear application fee for like a contest or a festival, like I just start to like bristle. Like I just can't because I get mad. I'm like, why do you have to pay? Like actors aren't paying
Pay
to
to play.
audition. Why are
Yeah, yeah.
you? So it's just crazy. So we're going to talk about all those things and to kind of keep building up how we're going to get into all of these individual topics. I want to transition over to Deborah and talk to you about the document that Heather was referencing, and that's the Dramatists Guild's best practices for contests and festivals. We released that back in like 2017, 2018, and you were actually very much a part of that process of writing and development. So what was the impetus for its creation, and what were you trying to do with it, and what were some things you learned in that process?
I think it came out of the brain of one of our members, Donna Hoke. I think it started there through some of her experiences. But like anything that we would look at the Guild, it was, this question, this need. I think from my end, where I was when I was the director of business affairs, answering questions. And there would be questions of is this festival good? Is this festival not good? And I used to ask the then executive director, Gary Garrison, Gary, like, is this a good one? Should I tell them they should do this or they should not? To them, I'm trying to wrap my head around that. And it became clear, not only from what playwrights were saying, but even internally, that like there was a little bit of confusion here as to what makes a good festival. I mean, there were some festivals that had a lot of, notoriety attached to them, right? So they would be maybe great, or, if you get into this, like, look what came out of there, great. So maybe we could evaluate a couple of the bigger ones. But for the smaller ones, for schools, for colleges, especially if they wanted to get into this field, what were they putting forward and how do we evaluate those? So that's sort of why we created this. I think we created it out of the need to and I should say as well, like anything at the Guild, it's a best practice. It's not like, as much as I want you to hold this as your Bible, like it's not necessarily biblical, or it's just a best practice, but it is representative of what our group of playwrights felt they would like to see. And I totally appreciate Heather's sentiment that, like, if you want to make playwrights happy, maybe listen to the things that they're looking for and for what kind of experience they're looking for. So that's sort of where it came out of, right? Yeah, I mean, with anything, right? Isn't that part of the inquiry one should make? So that's where it came from. It was many months of conversation with, we had a whole group of playwrights. Do they have access to the document? I'm not sure. But
I put it in the files I don't know if you guys have access to the files, but I could upload relevant documents into the description of the session. So I think it's there. I hope it's there.
Oh, okay. Well, we were a group of like 10 playwrights. We would just gather and talk and talk and talk and talk. And here's what went wrong. Here's what went right. And, ultimately we arrived at our best practices. And also not only providing sort of what are the practices we'd like to see, but an explanation of why we're asking for those things. So maybe if something doesn't quite work for you, you could look at the explanation and play with that a little bit as well. So that's where it yeah.
One of the things I love about the best practices document is that explanation point, because it says, sometimes, because nothing is black and white, we can put out these best practices and not even the best festival on earth will probably meet all of them. There may be one sticking point there. And so it's really, I love that the explanations kind of say, well, if you don't do this, think about it this way, or think about it in relation to all the other things that are happening with the festival. So I think it's important to understand that nothing is perfect, but finding the opportunity that makes the most sense for you in your particular journey and what you're trying to do is really important. So
And they might be really high on one point and low on another, and that might
Right.
make it a good opportunity for that particular playwright where they are in their
Yeah.
life and in their career. So we really have to understand why you're asking for what you're asking for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because there are even some, I'm going to put this in air quotes because it's subjective, but there are very reputable festivals that do ask for, submission fees. And as much as we want to frown upon that, we can't discount the fact that if you get into this festival, it is a very good opportunity for you as a playwright. So yeah, so when we're talking about all these guidelines, I want to make sure that this conversation, there's like a disclaimer that you can make it work for your particular organization, but if you keep the playwright in mind the whole time, you are probably doing the right thing. So with that said, I kind of want to use the best practices guideline as guidelines for our chat today. So I also want to encourage all of our panelists, like this is a conversation I'm moderating, but like jump in whenever you want to jump in, have conversations with each other. I don't need to be the only one talking. So what I want to start with is first identifying the difference between a contest and a festival. I think they get conflated together a lot because sometimes a contest can feel like a festival because the winning thing is a production, and that's what a festival is. So a festival is when you are submitting your work to be part of some sort of public presentation of some sort, whether that's a full production, whether that is a reading series, what have you. A contest, on the other hand, is when you are submitting your play to be considered for some sort of prize. And that prize can be a production, it can be publication, it can be money, it can be a residency, it can be any manner of things. And so it's really, when you are deciding what you want to develop, you want to make very clear what it is that you are developing. So I just want to get that clear right off the top. And now I want to kind of transition into some more direct questions. And this is I think, the most important one for educators. And so I want to start with that one. And that is, educators need to answer the question of, is this festival or contest that you're developing going to be part of the curriculum for your students, or is it an optional extracurricular activity? Because if it's a part of the curriculum, the nature of the contest and festival changes. And I'm going to ask Deborah why that is, but anyone can jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime something is part of a curriculum, it changes the nature of it. I mean, we see that a lot with productions, right? If you want to produce, a show as part of your school, is it part of the classroom? Is it closed? Are people coming in? You start to ask all these other questions. And I think in the context of, contests and festivals, if something's, you have to ask yourself the question of who's owning what you're doing. And I think, to me, it doesn't so much matter whether it's part of the curriculum or not, because I feel like an author should own what they're creating, no matter what. But it does get dicey, and I've seen situations where it gets dicey, where say a professor might ask his class to write parts of a show, and then they're putting this together, and then has the control over that show. And I see smiles. I'm going to say your name wrong because I'm not going to say your name. but
Riza has just been part of one of those.
I got it right the first time. I don't want to jinx myself.
I've had this conversation with a lot of women. I'm happy to weigh in once you're done talking.
Yeah. So I think, to me, it's, you have to get down to the basics of it. So if I'm submitting this to my professor for a competition, I would think I would still own it. But what does the professor think about what they're doing? And what rights does the college think they're getting because they give you a prize? Is that now part of their canon that they can do forevermore? I would think not. But, it gets sticky. And that's why I think you have to just be really clear about the ownership component and the control going forward. Who's going to control that play? and it can be very confusing in a school context, especially when a school's investing all this money and who knows what their impetus is for creating the contest or festival. Maybe they do want to increase, have a canon of student produced works and license those to other places to make money, which is not great for the playwright involved. So I think that that's sort of the question that has to go off into the organizers' minds for transparency, and for the betterment, I think, of the group. I've just seen so many situations within a school where the educator felt that they were owning whatever they were creating in the context of a classroom. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but that's a conversation that should happen, right? Before anyone starts writing. And then if you're required to write for this thing, well, that just makes it even more wild. Like, am I paying to create something that then you own? That doesn't seem like a really smart economic model. So, that's sort of the big question mark, I think, that comes up for me anyway, in, the school context. But Jess, I don't know if there's something else you wanted to
I'll
hit
let
on.
Arisa kind of speak to that, and then I'll touch on some
Yeah.
other things that I think about when I think about the group.
Yeah. Arisa, go first. Yeah.
Yeah, I've definitely had this conversation, not in the context of contests, but with colleagues and fellow artists who are devisers, and they were part of a program that was heavily devising. And a lot of times they said, I felt like I was paying to help an educator create their play. And that got sticky, and it was something that we had a conversation. Actually, I'm going to call it out because somebody in this Zoom was part of a project that I worked on. I wrote a play for students at Texas A&M Corpus Christi, and there was a part of that process that I was coming in for a weekend to do work with the students about this. It was a historical topic that the play was going to be about. And I was developing this weekend workshop, and I specifically had a conversation with that colleague because I developed this devising workshop, and he was like, be careful that you're not asking students to write your play for you. And I was very much conscious of that as I developed the workshop, and made that workshop very much about these students engaging with this historical material, so that when they were later in the play that was going to be made, felt like they knew something about this historical material. And the purposes of that workshop for me was what do they find interesting about this historical material? I'm not taking the plays that they made and making it my play. It was more of what do they find interesting? Because I knew at the end of that process, I was owning the play, even though it was done at the school. So for me, that was such a conscious part of the work that I was doing, of making sure that I wasn't taking advantage of students who are paying to be in school and taking oh, I liked that scene, now it's going to be in my play, that kind of thing. But I do think that this is something that happens a lot in educational settings, where that question of who owns this, is this something that students created and they have ownership of it, or is an educator coming in and working with students, and then at the end of the day it's their material. So yeah, I've had this conversation a lot not in terms of contests, but in terms of even just theater education. So that's why I was smiling, because it is a conversation I have very often with people who have, fellow colleagues and educators and theater artists.
Yeah. The other aspect of this question, and why I wanted to talk about it, is because it actually came up when I was at KCSATF out in Texas this year. I had, a playwright come up to me and say, I wrote this play. Now my school wants to program it for the main stage. And that is very different than you as a playwright, and part of your curriculum in your degree is, you're writing plays and they're getting produced as studio shows, and that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to write a certain number of plays as part of your degree. But it's different when the school approaches you and says, hey, now we want to program this show as part of our main stage. That is no longer a part of the curriculum. That's not a requirement for their degree. And so she was struggling because she was like, well, I deserve a contract. I deserve to be paid if that's happening. And I was like, yeah, you do deserve a contract. You do deserve to be paid. And so when I was putting together this conversation about contests and festivals, that story kept ringing in my ear. Because if it's a part of the curriculum, you maybe can forgo the concepts of contracts and things like that, because it's just part of what they're doing in order to get their degree. You're not having them sign production contracts when they're producing their studio shows like they normally would. But if it's outside of the curriculum, if it's an optional extracurricular thing that the playwrights can choose to apply to or not, then it transforms the nature of that relationship that you have with those playwrights. Yes, they are your students, but also they are playwrights applying to a contest or festival that is not a part of what they have to do. And so that's when you're going to have to think about, okay, I do need to give them a contract. Am I going to pay them if we're going to perform this? So ownership is a huge thing, because there's a lot of questions about ownerships in educational settings, just like Deb and Arisa just highlighted. And I've heard many horror stories of those as well. But it's also, how do we treat them? Are they still students, or are they like hybrid student professionals? So
Although it's kind of interesting, Jess, though, because even if you're with, this is just me going down the rabbit hole with you, but
yeah.
if you have a content, if you're running something with,
Oh no.
Oh, no.
I just lost Deborah in the middle of the conversation. All right, well, we'll continue
Oh no,
chatting
actually,
about it.
I have another
Yeah, Heather, please.
point to bring up until Deborah comes back.
Yeah.
I hope so. So I want to name that coming from less of a devising and more of a playwright centered, like the playwright is the author in the room, topic in relationship to this, and it's reporting with students to read in a class, is that there is a lot of emotional labor in reading plays. And I say this as someone whose literary management career for the past 4 years has been reading plays. I'm going to put a pin in this to make sure Deborah's back. Yep. Okay. Yep. Back. Do you want me to finish my sentence? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Yeah, you can finish your sentence, please.
Okay.
Please.
Deborah, I went off on another intersection with this, which is that there's a lot of emotional labor in reading plays. And I'm saying this as someone who has been reading everybody's pandemic play for the past 4 years.
Oh.
And pandemic plays are by nature intersectional and are in nature processing trauma. And when you ask students to read an unfinished play, looking for the potential in the play for how your classroom or your main stage or your black box stage wants to engage with this, you need to be prepared as educators to bring your 120% to things that are triggering, and provide some guide rails for the students that are reading when they encounter material. My both jobs, I work for both past 4 years in pandemic times. I've been reading for Playwrights Foundation, where we had a community of 175 intergenerational readers. Some readers were just out of undergrad and all the way up to elders. And then Jewish Plays Project is also an intergenerational working group of about 75 readers. And I need a lot of guardrails on the process for the emotional labor of receiving stories that are about the now, about the moment. I have to have a trigger warning policy for reading, just easy suggestion is because the readers are the first audience, which is always the definition of dramaturgy for me. A dramaturg is always the first reader on something that a writer is sharing with you. So if your students are going to be the first readers, have some protocols that I know so many educators have in their practices to figure out if a student is triggered by material that they're encountering for the first time and you don't know, like, because are you as an educator going to read all 30 or 50 plays that you're evaluating in advance to know what every play is about? Or are you going to distribute them to your students and say, read these plays, they sound good, these sound fun, these are writers that are interesting, whether the scripts are on their names are on the scripts or not. And then if a student, you encounter something, how do you intentionally build your own community guidelines for encountering the work? So a major part of my practice at both organizations is to really take time to create community guidelines so that we have some best practices in mind for encountering the emotional labor of reading. So that's my offering to this question.
Thank you. Deb, you were cut off, so I want to let you finish your thought if you remember it. Because I know I probably would have
well,
forgotten
it will take us backwards a little bit. But
That's
I was
fine.
just-
We're going to go
I
back
was
and
just-
forth.
I was just thinking that while you were saying if a production's outside the context of the classroom, then you should get paid. But sometimes they have presentations right within the classroom, and that's the competition. And then really you start to ask yourself, what's the nature of the presentation that they're having at the end of that? Because that could easily also morph into something that looks like, if people are paying and all sorts of people are coming in to watch this show, well, now it's gone from a tight classroom competition of the teacher maybe selecting who wins to something larger with audience that, it kind of makes you wonder if they should at least get a share of the money they're making for that production, for that presentation.
But I think actually this whole conversation highlights something that Heather brought up right at the beginning, which is the need for transparency and just understanding especially in an educational setting, because there are all these gray areas as it relates to copyright law, as it relates to, is it part of the curriculum, is it not, payment, ownership, all these things. It is imperative for the process to be very, very clear and to have channels available to writers who have questions about the process, so that they can ask those questions and get meaningful answers. And that means also, as educators who are developing the contest or festival, asking those questions to yourself before you ever do it. So that
It's such a great
those answers.
opportunity to learn and teach your students as well. Like, here's some questions, now that you wrote this, here's some questions you should know to ask now and in the future. So really, it's a great learning opportunity.
Yeah, I definitely agree, because just like actors are the first jobs they're going to have Tennessee Williams plays. No, the first job students are going to have are on new plays. So teaching best practices to engage with playwrights is vital to getting your students employed. I mean, like, that's really for me, like, my point of view is like, where are your students going to get jobs? They're going to get jobs in new plays. And if they don't know good practices, you're setting them up to struggle with their entry point into the profession.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I would also
Yes.
offer, like, to Deborah's point of most of what you learn as a playwright about like your contracts and getting your work produced and stuff like that comes from making big mistakes and like doing it like once you're out of school. So even something like if a school is offering like that, we're going to do your play and it's not part of the curriculum, and you do teach a playwright how to go through those processes of contracts and things like that, like that's such an invaluable education process that I don't know that I know has experienced while in school at their educational institution. I have also relied on the Dramatists Guild and like sending contracts through the like legal channels at the Dramatists Guild, and by calling my former professors and saying like, is this right? Or like, what am I doing? So I think even the process of teaching playwrights that's something that education is missing, that
Mhm.
arts education is missing. And that's such an opportunity rather than not giving a student playwright a contract and just doing their play because they're a student. That I think it's an opportunity for that kind of education.
I love that point. One of the things that the Dramatists Guild does quite frequently is go into classrooms with, MFAs, BFA playwrights and talk to them about what to look for in the industry, what to look out for in the industry, how to read your contracts. Because we recognize there was this gap in education, and it's not just for playwrights, it's for like really any artist who's in school. You are so rarely taught how the business actually works. And so I think developing a contest or festival, whether it's a part of the curriculum or not, is a really great opportunity to like give a rundown of like the basics of just like how to operate as a professional in the industry and what you need to be looking for. So that's a really great point. I want to go back, and we were talking about, Heather was talking about the reading of plays. And so I want to talk about like submitting and that whole process. One of the sections of the best practices guides talks about the types of plays and the authors that they're seeking. So contests and festivals can be really specific in what they're seeking in their submission guidelines. So when you are soliciting scripts in an educational setting, and I'll pose this to all of you and you can all kind of throw your 2 cents in, like, what are things that we need to think about in terms of like what the ask is? I think I talked a little bit about at the top, and I'll just put this into the world and let you all go. But about how you need to think about what your students need, and then develop a contest or festival based around that. But beyond that, when you're trying to solicit scripts, what are the things that we really need to be thinking about when it's in a school setting?
I'm always eager to jump in, but I want to make sure my
Please
colleagues.
go.
Okay. There's a number of points here. Okay. So I'm gonna just go back to the top where I said like empathetic and compassionate, diverse readership, open to non-traditional work. In
Mhm.
that is my personal statement because I'm interested in non-traditional forms and play. So part of it, and this is what I experience as like when I'm training readers to read for an organization, is that like how are non-traditional forms taught at your school, and then how do you also teach looking for potential in unfinished play? Because a lot of times we get back to like, well, I didn't like it. Here's why I didn't like it. How are you going to train your students? This is a huge question for me. For me, I feel this very deeply. Like you're looking for the potential of the work because when you're working with a contest and festival, a piece may be unfinished because the whole point of the exercise is to bring the writer in, work with them, get the students invested in the process. So training students to see the potential of a piece uh, and being able to have those conversations, I think is a really important learning that your classroom can have that's exciting. Also, and this comes from this week, I've been interviewing Jeannie Baroga for an LMDA legacy article. Who, if you don't know Jeannie Baroga's work, you should. Talk, Story, and Walls. And when Jeannie Baroga was like coming up in like the 80s at the Playwrights Center, and then deciding on who is the artist she wants to be in the Bay Area, she was realizing that the rubric of questions that a lot of new play development were asking for BIPOC writers was just wrong. So taking the time in a contest and festival to really investigate the evaluation questions for the process could really be is where the work needs to be before you do the exercise. Like every teacher knows how to put a rubric together, but Jeannie and I were just chatting about like, are you talking to playwrights with what kind of feedback is useful to them on what they need before you decide how you're going to pose the questions so that your students can engage with the work and analyze it and critically discuss it beyond I liked it or I didn't like it or this makes me uncomfortable or this is weird. So if you're going to be analyzing new work, which is playing with new forms, playing with difficult emotional questions, I think care, consideration, intentionality in how you write your questions for any contest and festival is where you want to spend a lot of thoughtfulness. And if you don't have that time, really think about like the whole exercise that you're setting up.
Thank you for that. Deborah?
No, I'm digesting that. I guess also you're talking about when submitting or when the reader's reading?
Both.
Both.
Like I'm talking about like the questions that the playwrights have to answer, and going back to some of my data points, writers want a very simple application. So, and some writers are further down the line in the study, it's like, all I want is my play to be read. There's so many contests and festivals to apply to, like Ariza's point at the top about like throwing the pennies in the wishing well. Like, oh, I see this opportunity, boom, boom, boom. I'd love to just give my name in my play. And, artistic statements are laborious for playwrights to write, and they're writing them at 11:59 at night. Development goals, what do you want to work on, can be more emotional labor. Sorry, emotional labor is the phrase right now, but for me, but there's emotional labor on the reader side, there's emotional labor on the playwright side. So just posing the questions in the application need to be clear, transparent, and figure out why you're asking. Also, a big part of our study was letters of recommendation, and I definitely want to get into this, and I want to do a shout out to Nick Malikow, who was part of our working group. Lindsay Joel was also part of our working group, Lucy Wang, but we got into a lot of conversations, and Nick Malikow constantly brought up a letter of recommendation is a form of privilege. Not everybody has access to education. Not everybody has access to recommenders. Asking even for a letter of recommendation for a writer out in the world could have all these different layers of privilege and access and accessibility. Taking the time to get a recommender to write something. I know for when I recommended Ariza, I just appreciated it was a quick phone call if I had to, but Ariza and I were working at the time, and that was an easy thing for me to do as a recommender. But just asking for a letter of recommendation has like complicated layers of privilege baked in. So thank you, Deborah, for asking me to clarify, because that's like bucket number one, right? When you're writing questions. Bucket number two is the how are you going to ask the students to evaluate this play so they can dig deeply into what the play is, what is the play's central dramatic question, and walking them through the process of analysis that it's different for like a piece that's still in process than something that's finished. So like also like just to throw in, like Jewish Plays Project is currently running a 10-minute play festival contest, and we were clear on the website that these 10-minute plays are finished products because the time that Jewish Plays Project had on the back end to get the 10-minute plays like rehearsed at the Berkshires, there's no development time. It's like, this is the 10-minute play that it is. Jewish Plays Project has no intention to develop it. If the writer wants to make changes, they can, but we're not going to dramaturg it. We're just going to put it up in the Berkshires. And in that 10-minute play festival, so that's an organization being super clear. On the reader side of it, we had to then say to the readers, if this 10-minute play is not meeting the mark, you have to evaluate it in terms of like, it's set in stone. Don't ask the writer to change the ending. If you don't like the ending or if you don't like where the story is going, that's not an option for this contest. So like in putting that whole contest for Jewish Plays Project together this summer, it was very clearly communicating with both the playwriting community and the reader community, you know, while other programs, the Jewish Plays Project is looking for development potential, those things, this particular contest was like 10-minute play, good, start to finish, no asking the writer for changes, accept it with what's on the page. You know, so that's what I mean is like, it's two big buckets to think about when you're writing your questions. Because then you got to live by that. And that's the agreement that you're making. Yeah. So Deborah, is that helpful to unpack?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Yeah.
I'm
You know,
thinking-
I never think about it. You know, I don't apply to festivals and contests, so I don't often like read a ton of the application, but I've read a lot of submission guidelines, which are different. So it's interesting to hear that there's so many then barriers to the application itself. One would hope that like the play speaks, you know, more
right.
than
And that's why
you know,
I
the
think
recommendation,
yeah, I think they're very simply, that's why like 71% of playwrights in our survey said just, you know, just ask for the script, don't ask for additional material.
Right.
But just because Ariza and I have also been through it with the process of development goals and how useful those can be. I don't know, Ariza, do you want to jump in and kind of share about like why development goals, which takes the writer some time to write, are helpful?
Yeah. I think specifically, I mean, if we're talking in the context of developing a festival for in an educational setting and for an educational purpose, again, I keep coming back to like, I wish I'd had this when I was in school, because I think I really learned, it took being out of school and writing development goals and being a part of a festival and realizing like, oh, I got this opportunity because I knew exactly what I needed to work on. And that's a skill that's like acquired after doing festivals or doing these applications for a while and realizing like, oh, right, like, again, I have this amount of time, this is what I can work on in this, and this is what needs to be fixed in my play. And that's just like a thing that took me experience, that if I'd had that in an educational setting, maybe like outside of school, it would have been, it would have just like clicked better. And now as like an educator, I mean, this last spring I taught a class to undergrads that was called Colloquium, and it was all about this like artistic statements and agents and applying to things. And I know that for my students, when I would get their artistic statements back, I was like, this is just such an elusive thing for you, and it feels like it's not something you're ever going to use, and you're going to have to use it like tomorrow. So it was this thing where if I had had a contest right there for them that like put, you know, this is what you're writing this for, I think that would have been so valuable for them to realize like, oh, I need to have a sense of who I am, what my work is, and how to communicate like what's important to me and how that goes along with this thing that I'm giving you to read. Because the reality is that is something that they are going to need out in the world. So like, if it were part of this education in school, like that, the notes that I was giving them of like, you have to revise this, and like, I read your work and I don't know, you know, I read your work and you're selling yourself short, you know, like, so I think that, you know, artistic statements are laborious. These questions that come up in festivals are laborious. And, you know, now that I've been a playwright for several years, and several parts of my life when I had more time or had less time, had to have a day job more than like a more flexible schedule, you realize, I look back at some of my applications and I'm like, what? Like, what was I even talking about? And I realized it's because I was writing it at 2 o'clock in the morning because I was working a 9 to 9 job. And then later when I was working 20 hours, you know, 30 hours a week, and at something that was nothing with playwriting, and then had more time to work on applications, like it made more sense. So it's a constant, it's a difficult thing to say like, you should do this or you should do this, because sitting on the other side of the table, I understand why you need development goals and why artistic statements are valuable, because sometimes it is the difference between, we have 2 plays. Does this
They're really great.
Yeah, you have 2 plays that are really great. Does this person know what they need to work on versus this person who's just like, I want to hear it out loud, like, so I think to me, the festivals and contests that I appreciate are the ones that are like, round one, read your play. Okay, we liked the play. Now round two, let's get an artistic statement, or tell us what you want to work on. Because even for me, like most processes I've been in as a reader, that is kind of the process we take. So you don't necessarily need all the information at once. Like if we've read the play and like it, we want to hear more. If we read the play and it's 10 characters and we can only do 5, we know it's not going to move forward. So you don't necessarily need the playwright to do all that work.
Mhm.
That being said,
Yes,
if
that.
you're not going to take a play with 10 people, say that at the beginning so that a playwright is not submitting a play with 10 people and then getting rejected and thinking you didn't like the play.
And conversely, like for educators, it's like we need more people. We need large cast plays, right? It's like, as I'm reading at Players Foundation Jewish Plays Project, where it's like 2 characters, 3 characters, great, that's producible. But like educators need like, no, give me 10 women, right? Or give me like 5 non-binary characters, right? So it's I think that clarity up front is great, and to just kind of Riza and I riff a lot because we've been in it together. But I think it's really the point being like going back to transparency and you knowing what you want as an educator, but it could be so useful in the training of future playwrights, so useful in the training of dramaturgs or dramaturgically minded directors, to just really like be thoughtful in how you're setting up the exercise. And because like no one teaches it, and it's why Riza was like, I wish I had it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to highlight a couple of things that were just said. I've been like writing down notes because so many different things popped up. But I love there's this like I think a push and pull here of what Heather was talking about in the beginning of playwrights. Like I want a simple application, and I don't know if maybe a simple application is the best option in an educational setting, because if the industry is not doing these simple applications, then to prepare the students to go out onto the world, they should know how to write an artistic statement. They should know how to define what their development goals are before they have to go do that in a more intense place. And then what are we looking for? That's the other thing that I wanted to highlight. It's just like when you're in school, it can't be like amorphous. It can't just be like submit a play. It's still, you still have to have really specifics about what it is that you want this contest or festival to be. Is it a 10-minute play? Is it a 1-act? Is it from writers from speaking from a certain perspective? Is it about a particular theme? It needs, I think the specificity, even though it's your students, it still needs to be there, whatever that specificity is. And we're not going to tell you what that is. That's your decision. And then I want to go back to kind of the beginning of this whole question and Heather talking about student readers. And I want to make a distinction here. And this is talking about once you receive the submissions, how do you evaluate them? And Heather's talking about having like really specific evaluation criteria that can even be shared with the people submitting so they know how their work is being evaluated. But also in an educational setting, who is reading the work? Is it you and your faculty? Are you going to train students to do it? Do you have a dramaturgy department at your school that you can take them and teach them how to read for the future? Or are you going to outsource it to people in the community? So I think and that also ties into the best practices document. I know we talked about this right before we even started this conversation, is our best practice document encourages blind submissions, but we also understand that sometimes blind submissions aren't the best option. And so I kind of want to just talk about this subject of like, how do we evaluate, who is evaluating as a group? So if anyone wants to speak on that, please go for it.
Deborah, I would actually love to hear you talk about like how your committee arrived at the blind practices, fully naming and full disclosure that like I'll also talk about how like LMDA's best practices document looks very similar to this, but this is the one like sticky point on it. But how did that all kind of come together originally?
I'm trying to find which one that is, if I could even locate it on here. Oh, right, the blind submission throughout its process. So can I just refresh my memory?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Yeah, I think, you know, again, it's been a little bit of time, so I can't like recount like the actual conversation that we had. But I think the concept was we want to be able to submit our play and not have any bias appear in that process. So I think, for example, older playwrights. A lot of the times festivals are looking for the next best young person, you know, so by offering a blind submission, does that help? Older playwrights get read, get seen, get selected, things like that. I think, you know, to the extent that a contest or festival is looking for a specific kind of playwright and trying to raise up a particular voice, then I think they should say that outright. That's great. We're all for it. Then you're not wasting a bunch of other people's time. You're not wasting their resources. You're not wasting your own resources. But once those people have submitted, then they should be on an equal footing. And, you know, the concept being that the best play will rise to the top. That's sort of my understanding of it, although that could always change from the guild standpoint. So just you're welcome to chime in if you feel things have changed from that.
I mean, we could talk and deconstruct the idea of like what is the best all day as far as I'm concerned, but we only have time. I'll say this, what's messy and subjective is that sometimes these contests and festivals don't know exactly how to define like what they're looking for in terms of like identity. You know, it's not like, yeah, there's a contest festival that says like, well, you know, maybe it's like, you know, a festival who wants this one singular identity. For bigger, just I'm speaking professionally right now, and then we'll figure out how that intersects with education. It's like there's, if you have a diverse selection process internally, there's going to be a need for anti-bias training, because I think answering this question is like, how do you address everybody's bias? Everybody has a bias towards what they're, and again, like going back to a point made earlier, is like, how do you get students to talk beyond about I like this or I didn't like this or this makes me uncomfortable? So in the both organizations that I've been working for the 4 years, like building in time for anti-bias conversations kind of goes hand in hand with like building a community agreement for readers. So if you have like community agreements, then you can have like time. If you're trying to do everything in a rush because you need to do things fast, there's going to be some stumbles and lessons learned. But and I'm not saying that like at any place I've worked for, I've ever seen us not get into really messy conversations. But in fact, you know, have gotten very complicated, and Ariza has witnessed that. But I do think this question of, and for just to name it, Jenna Rogers and Phaedra Michelle Scott in LMDA's best practices document does talk about reading with cultural competency, because there's some plays involve that understanding of the community that's being written about. Another concrete way of saying is like some plays are bilingual or trilingual. And so one practice that like I implemented was having like a reader survey where the readers could self-identify. Do they have any particular experiences or leanings? For example, like if a reader was able to read Portuguese, that's great because I will get to play with Portuguese in it. And just knowing that I can say like, I can have one blind reader, but then I need to make sure I have a cultural competency read on this. But for many different communities, it can be it can be very complicated because like if the play is written by an Indigenous writer and you in your room, you may or may not have an Indigenous writer from the particular region of indigeneity that's being discussed. How are you going to provide cultural competency on that in your process? So these are the challenges of the profession right now that I think are exciting questions to lean into instead of lean away from.
Do you mean cultural competency in terms of your ability to handle the work? Like say you're going to produce it, or
Yeah.
are you saying when I'm selecting it, I'm bringing
You-
biases in? Well, I think you were saying both maybe that
Yeah,
you
like
might be
both. I
bringing
mean,
biases
you bring
into
biases in. Like if you have a Hawaiian Indigenous playwright, writing about their life experience, like how are you going to? And it's in a room full of white students. There is a huge history of colonialism between those two communities. How do you decolonialize the literary office process in that regard? So that's like big things that I think about all the time as a literary manager. But Ariza, since you've been in the thick of it with me, do you have any kind of observations?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're reading experiences outside of your own, like it's, if somebody had a lived experience close to mine, like my characters are going to sound like real people. And I think I've had people read my work and be like, oh, I don't know people like this. I'm like, really? Because I don't, I was gonna name a play, but I'm not. But there are certain plays that I read and I'm like, who is like this? And then I realized like, oh, other people have experiences like that, And it was a famous play. I was like, I don't know people like this, but other people obviously have. So I think that, there's to your point of cultural competency, I think that different readers are going to have different experiences with different kinds of work based off of your biases and your background. I think in terms of like blind submissions and specifically thinking of educational settings, I mean, I've had conversations with other playwrights where we're like, I don't know that blind submissions are an actual thing. The theater community, when you think about it, especially if you've been a playwright for at least 5 years and been submitting to things and been putting your work out and doing things, a lot of people are going to know the play that you're submitting and know that it's your play. We all know each other's work. We're reading each other's work, people who are actively members of that. But the anomaly is when you read a play and you're like, I've never read anything like this before. I don't know who this is. But there's a general sense of like, is there such a thing as blind submissions? Because in reality, the theater world is pretty small. But and it's gonna in an educational institution, if you're
Even
have
smaller.
you have a yeah, it's even smaller. Your professors are gonna know, like any professor who's read their student evaluations knows that you know what your students sound like. These like blind student evaluations, I'm like, I know exactly who wrote that. Or like things like that. So I think there's also a degree of what your students sound like, but at the same time, I think in an educational setting, depending on if you open it up beyond the department, if you open things up, like you don't want a student to feel that, the student who, when I look back on like my time as an undergrad, especially, you don't want somebody to feel like, the person who always gets picked is always going to get picked because they've worked with this professor on this play or whatever, that kind of thing. I think that's where blind submissions can be useful and helpful. But at the end of the day, there is always that question of, are submissions truly blind? And to me, it's difficult because sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, depending on the community.
Yeah, and totally agree. Because also the literary, I've been challenged by playwrights like through my job at Jewish Play Project, like, how is this really blind? Because you, Heather Holinsky, know who wrote this. Like, your readers may not, but and your artistic director knows. I will say this, and I'm just gonna put this out in the space because I think this kind of like resets the conversation, is that like I think baked into the equation of contest festivals in general, it's asking a larger question of like, am I seeing this artist as the product of this one thing that they made, which gets into capitalism, like seeing an artist in terms of the product as part of the holistic artist that they are.
Mm.
So when you're really thinking through the question of like, how do I set up this exercise? There's something that I've gotten feedback over the past 4 years that writers are really craving, which is for organizations, whether educational or professional, to just see them as a whole artist who has created this one of many plays. And I don't know if anybody's figured out the secret sauce yet of although I will name that like there's a number of really good organizations that like New Harmony and Playwrights Realm, where the feedback I receive from playwrights on them is like sometimes even just the nature of how New Harmony phrases their questions or what Playwrights Realm is doing really helps move the conversation forward to like your questions are leading into seeing the person as an artist, whether
Mm.
rather than, oh, we like this story, let's find out who wrote it. So I think that's where like blind not blind like gets into, and this is why like Dramatist Guild, let's have more conversations together and figure it out. Like how do we not see the writer as a product of this one instance that they're writing, but maybe like an exciting artist you want to bring to your program.
Yeah.
But that's also, you know, you can treat them well once you've taken their play, you know, you can
Right,
treat
right,
them
right,
like
right,
a
right.
whole art, you know, like sometimes we have to just make rules to get, you know,
No, exactly.
to
Like,
get to our
but
end
how did they
point.
get
But
to that
then
point?
once you've
Yeah.
got the play, are you going to treat them like a human being and an artist that might have other plays coming in the future? Or are we
Yeah.
just going to like, you know, squeeze them for that one, this is all you got, you know?
Yeah. I
Yeah.
want to be mindful of time.
Yep.
We have about like 5-ish minutes left. So I want to end this conversation and talking about it's kind of a big topic, but not so much. But it's just if you're going to do this, what are you going to give your students? And what are you going to ask of your students? And that's like the macro way of talking about it. But I come from giving, and that question comes out of, you know, there are types of festivals called DIY festivals. DIY festivals are where you are not being produced by the organization that chose you. You are being presented by the organization that chose you, meaning you are producing yourself and your play under the banner of this organization. And if that is the type of festival that it is, the guidelines need to make it explicitly clear as to that's what it is, and also define what it is that the festival is doing for you. I, when was thinking about this topic, was really worried, thinking like, wow, this actually sounds like the studio show in a theater like a theater program, you know, where it's like, we're going to let you produce this show at our school and we're going to call it a production by X university, but actually you're writing it, you're finding the director, you're finding the designers, you're casting it, you're doing everything. So that's what I really want to think about. Like, what if you're going to do a contest or festival, what are you asking of the students? What are you providing to the students? And then what are you as an organization asking for? And this harkens back all the way to the beginning of the conversation where, you know, we were talking about ownership and like, are you planning to like take it and put up a part of your canon? I want to make sure like if you're planning to do a contest or festival, you're not asking for like future billing rights or future subsidiary rights participation and things like that. So I'll throw that out to the group, but just talking about like what are you asking of your students and what do you want from your students and what are you giving them in return? So the push and pull of the actual production or festival itself.
I think it's tricky because I don't think there's like a golden rule
Yeah.
here, but it just feels like, you know, if you're doing a certain amount, then maybe you get billing, right?
Yeah.
And in what context? You know, again, you might think about it, is it baked within the curriculum or is this
Mhm.
just something the school is doing that you're participating in? I mean, I think maybe all of us came from theater, but like I feel like we've all had those moments when we put together our own thing in college because that's what we had to do. I wouldn't have expected anyone to like charge and take the money, that would have felt like a little skeezy, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to know, when do you start giving things as a playwright? When do you accept to chip part of your pie and give it away? And what do you need to be doing to get to that point? And I would argue that you have to do a lot. It's not just hosting the competition, for your friends and family to come and watch the winner, right? It would have to just be something that was truly developed, time was truly spent. They're leaving with something that's, first of all, owned by them, and then also a value that you've added some incredible value to that play. And I would hope it doesn't go beyond a billing in my way. Like, I'm thinking of development. If somebody is truly developing that work with students, okay, maybe we could discuss that, but it's so hard to know out of a particular context.
Yeah.
But in general, I would think that you should leave with all your money and future ability to
Yeah.
you need to keep those things, because hopefully you'll need to give them away later to someone who can actually add the value that you need to get to the place you're trying to go to. So one would also think, look, if you're doing a good job, then you're going to get a great reputation for this contest and festival and developing young writers coming out of school. And there's a lot of value just by doing a good job. You're adding value to your own name.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I'll let Heather and Arisa speak on this last points, and then we'll wrap up. How's that sound?
Yeah, no, I really think that the field of playwrights really needs the education world to partner with them for these opportunities for development. There's huge scarcity issues right now in American regional theater. So, I mean, if you have the time, space, and energy to walk down this road, you are really serving the field of playwrights. And so I just want to say, like, deep gratitude for this conversation. Because I'm a person who wants to work out of a place of abundance. And what you're also giving your students are like those connection points, those professional lifts, as far as and the way that that these contests and festivals, the whole discussion of how to do them can be great. It really enhance your curriculum and get deeply into the learning. I know through KCACTF, I've seen a number of dramaturgy casebooks where like the Dramaturgs Project was to be a part of planning and organizing this festival, which I would have loved to learn as a young dramaturg, instead of dramaturging another production of Anne Frank. You're also giving space to what's in the air right now, with the stories that you're telling, and really the students will be very excited to be a part of telling of stories that meet the moment that they're in. And who doesn't need that right now? You're going to be, and I think these intersections between professional playwrights and students, just can help on so many levels. Including like walking through that difficult, challenging process on like, how are we going to put guide rails on it? How are we going to set up the exercise well? It's the more that you can, the more opportunities there are for deep thinking about new work. I feel like benefits the profession right now, and benefits everyone, benefits the students. So I want you to walk away from this conversation going, yes, I'm going to make new plays, but yeah, there's a lot of thoughtfulness and intentionality in here, because if the profession needs more places to develop their work because of scarcity, then everything Jessica and Deborah are saying about like subsidy rights, like, no, they don't need another person asking them for a piece of the pie at the end of the day, because there's been projects that I know of this year where the writer at a professional regional theater only walks away with $1,000, and that is wrong. All that work and labor for a world premiere, and you just get $1,000 out of it. So yes, like I just want to say more more educators can engage with this conversation, we can move the field forward. But it must be done with a lot of thoughtfulness and intentionality. And racing through a process will cause a lot of challenges to bubble up. So I just want to like say, please do this with intentionality, with time, care, thoughtfulness for all of the parties involved. And over to you, Ariza.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say a lot of like, I agree with a lot of what Deborah said. There's a lot of different factors of like if it's part of your curriculum or not. I mean, when you're talking about developing a festival for educational purposes and like DIY festival, as an educator, what I want to give my students is the opportunity to fail. I think they should be able to fail in school. And I don't mean get enough on the report card. I mean, like make mistakes. And I think too many times that a lot of like college productions or college festivals and, you know, it becomes more about like how can we make this look perfect? And I think that these things should be there to serve students in learning what this process is like and what it's going to be like when they get out of school. So like if you were saying a DIY festival at a school, like that sounds so like exciting to me as an educator, because things I was trying to teach my students this year was like artistic statements, but also budgets and
Yes.
you know, things like that. So like I think they should have this opportunity to make a budget for $50 and learn the reality that that's not what it takes to make the play you think you're making. So I think the gift that I always try to give my students is this opportunity to fail and redo it and rewrite it. And I think that that's what festivals and productions and anything in educational settings should be doing for students. And teaching them like the reality of, okay, yes, these things, you know, you shouldn't be answering 5 questions on a festival that, you know, you might not get to the next round, but also there's value in sending your work to people to read it. Another thing it's funny because this came up with pay and stuff in this, like I told my students, I gave them like maybe 2 festivals that maybe you should pay for, and everything else in theater as a playwright, I don't know that you should pay for it, or I don't know that it's worth it unless if you're like, it's very niche. So yeah, I think that's the thing that I always want my students to come away with and to have the opportunity in an educational setting.
Great. Well, with that, we are at the end of our session. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and a huge thank you to Heather, Ariza, and Deborah for being amazing panelists. This was a really great discussion. I said at the top, you know, every time we do these panels, I learn a bunch, and that certainly happened today as well. So thank you all. And I hope everyone has a wonderful day. And if you want more information about the Dramatist Guild, check out our website, dramatistguild.com. And I really hope in the files you can find the best practices guide for contests and festivals. Thank you.